Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-hosts, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson and community organizer and socialist Kenny Cepeda. We are online at what-s-left.webnode.com. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. Thank you. Today we are joined with Jessica, or Dr. Jessica. Jessica, who teaches English literature, writing, and environmental humanities at the university level in Washington State. She has been teaching college students for 8 years and holds a PhD in English. She is also an active member of environmental and animal rights activist communities. We are going to be having a lively discussion with her, and we look forward to it. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, Eduardo. It's great to be here.
Before that, though, Andy, if you could just read out or reach out to our audience because of a letter you have.
Yeah, so we're still reaching out to anyone. We look to do an episode in the future on folks talking about their experiences with the COVID vaccine, particularly if you've experienced an adverse effect from it and are open to talking about it online. Please reach us at the contact information in the description below. Go through our WebNode form. So let us know if you'd be open to discussing that in some future episode. And also, I do want to thank Jessica for coming here. We found out about you, Jessica, from you had heard one of our episodes about education, and we've mostly focused here on K through 12 education, elementary school or middle school or high school. And we really haven't talked about higher ed, and I found out that you were in higher education, actually a teacher in higher education, and I thought that would be a great opportunity to really talk about what your experience has been like this year and in previous years, because in many ways that's a gap. We haven't really talked about that area, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to talk about what was this last year like and what's happening in higher education, because there's changes happening in public education at the K through 12. But I think there's also changes happening at higher education as well. So I really thank you for taking this opportunity to talk about it, because I think it's important.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, it's great to be here, and I'm so grateful for all of you, because it's just thank God for you all, and happy to be in connection, even if it's through Zoom, in connection with some fellow teachers in solidarity.
Yeah. So let's start maybe with some basic information. If you could just share with us your background in education or how you got into teaching, your experience in general.
Sure. So I've been teaching college-age students for about 8 years. I majored in English in my undergrad, and I thought originally I wanted to work in editing and publishing in that kind of arena. But after a couple of years working in publishing after undergrad, I decided I wanted to go to grad school to work on my creative writing, to kind of have like space and time to do that. And so I originally started teaching as a way to fund that MFA degree. And I pretty much immediately fell in love with teaching and haven't looked back since. And so after my master's, I stayed on to do a PhD in English in order to become a college professor. And I've taught college classes over the past 8 years in everything from literature, composition and rhetoric, creative writing, interdisciplinary writing. And in the past couple of years, like you mentioned, Eduardo, in your intro, the past couple of years, I've been largely focused on environmental humanities. So for those that maybe aren't familiar with that term, essentially environmental humanities is studying environmental issues through the frame of language and rhetoric and narrative and literature, storytelling. And yeah, I mean, the past like 5 years especially, I think I've really witnessed a big change, a lot of changes in higher education, and it's all kind of coming to a head the past year, of course, during the COVID era. But to me, just being in this space over the past 8 years, academia it's pretty much unrecognizable from even just a few years back.
because so clearly you got really inspired about teaching. Can you say what it was that you really liked about it? You know, and what got you so excited about doing it? Because everyone talks about how hard it is. And then maybe talk about some of those changes that you've seen.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely fell in love with teaching from really the beginning. I you know, you're an English major. Everyone asks you like, oh, so you want to teach? And I was always like, no. In part because I didn't know if I'd be good at it. But once I entered the classroom, yeah, you just start forming these relationships, as all three of you know, with students. And I found, you know, it's a space where you really, especially in the humanities, you really get to foster critical thinking and creativity. And especially if you're, you know, lucky enough to have relatively small class sizes, which I have, certainly in comparison to a lot of my colleagues in the sciences. It can be a really radical space and a transformative point, and especially like college age, when I think back to my own experiences, like that was a really pivotal time. And to have good teachers, supportive teachers, it's incredibly rewarding. So I love it. I don't want to leave.
And you said though that things, you've seen some changes in the, not just this last year, but in the years coming up to the year where COVID hit education.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the efforts, especially corporate efforts, to kind of infiltrate, privatize, as I know you guys talk about on here, and just, you know, kind of control the public university and public education at large. You know, that's really laid the foundation over years, decades really, for what's happened the past year and a half. And I found it really difficult the past few years. It seems kind of like the parameters of any given discussion or critique are increasingly controlled by establishment powers. And that, to me, I mean, that runs totally counter to what the academy is supposed to be, or what I kind of thought it was when I came in and was like, yeah, I love to read, I love to write, I want to foster these critical thinking skills and creativity in my students. And, you know, the principle of academic freedom, right? Like the idea that this is a space where you can have open debate, you can have, you know, radical ideas, and you can express dissent, and that it's not only accepted, but that it's actually encouraged. And I am finding that's just not the case anymore, like if it ever was.
I mean, I'm just curious, you know, at least from my point of view, it's pretty clear that, you know, in certain fields like science and, you know, at the university level, these corporate ties and corporate interests have hijacked knowledge, you know, creation, and you know, to use it for their own ends. And so I'm just curious, like in your particular field, you know, how, if you've seen that same thing, you know, in how that plays out, you know, how you mentioned language, you mentioned rhetoric, narratives, and how do you see that happening in academia, particularly in your field?
I mean, I think one of the differences between K through 12 and higher education to some extent in that regard is that you have most teachers who, you know, are in higher ed, they're simultaneously trying to do their own research, myself included, right? And we're all so specialized that I think that is one aspect of it that kind of creates this frame of mind where people, we're all super smart and we're hardworking and we're doing all this research. But I think that like super specialization is one aspect that kind of makes a lot of us unable to question the larger structures, and certainly like it's hard to push back through your work. And that's a problem, right? Like it makes you feel really like experty, for lack of a better word. But I think it, you know, yeah, you get to be kind of like the king or queen of your little corner of academia in some respect, but ultimately it's pretty disempowering in the material world, right? And then you pair that with, like you mentioned, Kenny, you know, the fact that broadly speaking, the universities they're in bed with Silicon Valley, they're in bed with the foundations, with hedge funds, with big pharma, like you name it. Like it's part of a larger structure, right? Where you have these institutions that they're serving and perpetuating the ruling class, even if we maybe don't like to admit it.
Can you talk a little bit about your either relationship with your colleagues, either through a union, political kind of stuff? I've never really thought about that, but it's interesting how you can essentially be, like you talked about, you can kind of almost become isolated in your expertise. So are there opportunities to talk with other colleagues about these changes or organize in any way? Can you speak about that?
Yeah, so I have been since I entered higher education. I have been an active member of my union. I mean, I'm very, very pro-union, always have been. And there are spaces to some extent, I think, to have these discussions. But one of the frustrations that I've had with my union over the past few years is that I feel that increasingly the sort of identity politics, social justice rhetoric, to which I'm pretty empathetic to some extent, but I do think it oftentimes kind of overshadows this critique or any critique of the broader structure. It obscures the class analysis, of course, as I know you guys talk about on here. And for example, I mean, we the last cycle of bargaining that we did, we were able to organize a one-day strike, but it took everything, and then we couldn't get enough support, couldn't get enough mobilization to extend it. And I think that was 3 years ago, and then we just renegotiated our bargain this past spring during COVID, so it was all remote. And I think we're just seeing, like, increasingly the unions have just lost so much power. And then what little power we do have, we just seem like we're unwilling to leverage it in a way that would actually translate to material change, things like wages, things like healthcare, right? As much as I do think the sort of, diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff, which has become so ostensible in higher education and just kind of broadly speaking, as important as that stuff is, like, another diversity training is not going to allow anybody, let alone like minority workers and minority students, to pay their rent. Like, so yeah, I've grown pretty frustrated with the spaces that are available. And then of course during COVID, there are no conversations like that because there's nowhere to have them. No one's meeting in person, and you don't have these hallway interactions or before a meeting, after a meeting, right? Everything is sort of catered, and that's all we got.
Could you talk about, Jessica, the what's happened in terms of online education? Has that changed over the years in the time that you've been there? Because I think that is going to become an issue that I think we're going to be talking about. So I'd like to know if you've seen that change at all over the last 8 years.
It's a good question. I don't know that I'm the best person to answer it, just because I never taught online. I never taught any classes online prior to spring of 2020. I certainly, experienced sort of secondhand, pressure to increasingly use more technology in the classroom. We have an LMS, one of the learning platforms that we use at my institution, but yeah, I mean, I was kind of in my department, actually. I don't know how many teachers there are total, but I was one of the few people who was really pretty like old school, despite being a pretty young teacher. I was doing almost everything on paper. Like, students would print out their papers to turn them in. We would do, if there was an end of quarter portfolio, almost everybody else was doing online portfolios. I would have my students bring in the stack, right, all their revisions and their drafts, and write a cover letter. That was really important to me, and has grown increasingly so in the past year. But I was kind of, a little bit of a lone wolf in that respect. I would throw my syllabus up onto Canvas, but other than that, I was kind of able to skirt around it to some extent.
And I think maybe this is this, where we transition into asking you about your experience last year with, the pandemic and distance learning / teaching. How was that experience for you, over the last year?
It was catastrophic, honestly. It was really bad. I mean, obviously there were a lot of problems in public education before, some of which I was aware of, some of which I was aware of, but maybe not aware of the scope. But I mean, I've never seen anything like this unfold before in my life. And so end of March 2020, I was told to switch my spring class to be remote. And so we're on quarters at my institution as opposed to semesters. So it was kind of like right before spring break when everything kind of kicked off. And I think I had maybe 2 weeks of lead up from the time the official call was made, and they were like, you have to teach remotely. So it was crazy, and it's been fully remote ever since. Over a year now, and I think I've taught maybe like 9 or 10, like close to a dozen online classes since March of 2020, exclusively through Zoom / Canvas, which is our online digital platform at my school. And I mean, I've been doing my best, and I have the luxury, I suppose, of having smaller classes. Like I typically have, depending on the class, but around 20, 25 students. So I'm able to make some connections, some sort of, do the synchronous Zoom sessions. But it's not an education in my mind. It's just not. I think last year, so one of my classes for summer of 2020 was a class on public activism. And it was supposed to be super community engaged. I had proposed it like a year ahead, and I had, all these great plans to make, get the students, like break down the 4 walls of the classroom, get them out in the community off campus. And yeah, I mean, you guys tell me, like, how do you teach a public activism course through Zoom? It's a joke. And I mean, one other thing, like I've been really frustrated too, just with the administration and even sort of the upper department people at my school, like constantly being told, oh my God, you're so creative, you're so resilient, you teachers are amazing, you're adapting to these crazy circumstances. And like it's constant language like that coming from admin, and even from people outside the academy, from friends and acquaintances. And it's like everyone acknowledging that this situation is terrible for teachers, it's terrible for students, but no one wants to do anything to stop it. And to say like, oh, like, hey, our students are clearly suffering, maybe this isn't the greatest path forward. Yeah, it's great, they're super resilient, but that's a pretty poor excuse for what I see as heavily manufactured circumstances that kind of necessitate that resilience, which is now like chronic resilience, right? Mm-hmm. And I have seen among my students, this is totally anecdotal, but I have seen a significant uptick in learning disabilities, mental health diagnoses, like ADHD, bipolar disorder, tons of anxiety and depression. And that was something that I was very aware of in past years. It's a massive mental health crisis, especially on college campuses. But it's so much worse now. And I know the percentage of those sorts of cases that I am informed of, either directly from my students or from like our disability services office. I know those are such a small fraction of what's really going on. And so it's really difficult to hear that kind of like, again, like, yeah, calls for more support, more mental health support, but never any questioning of the policies and the conditions that are causing the problems in the first place.
Do you have a sense if this will continue, online learning, this technology will be embedded in some form at least partially in your, process of teaching?
I mean, every sign points to yes. I think at least in some capacity. So my institution has said supposedly that they are, pandemic pending, going back to in person fully in the fall. So we're talking a year and a half after pretty much everything has been online completely. But already, yeah, like there's the language of, oh, what tools do we want to bring with us? Like how can we incorporate some of these skills and online digital, whether it's like platforms or just approaches to teaching. And I mean, interestingly, at my school, we recently had student government put forth a measure for the fall. So when we're supposed to be back in person completely, they put forth a measure to essentially require that all classes that are in any way lecture-based be recorded, and that there be asynchronous options for any student who wants them, and that there be questions added, for example, to teacher evaluations to make sure that they're falling in line with that policy. So that, I mean, that's just a small example, and I don't believe it's passed. I don't believe that's going to be implemented at this point in the short term. But I think it's really scary that it's not only coming down from the top, like it's one thing coming from an administration or coming through, like state or federal, like public health frameworks, but to actually have the students themselves asking for that, to me is quite disturbing. And I think it's, it gives you a little bit of a window into what we're up against here.
I have talked with some of the students who graduated from Mission, who are in college right now and who went all online. And the one thing they say that they kind of like is they feel like they got their time back. Like they feel like they can control their time a little bit more by that online experience. I let them know there's a trap here in the, being built, constructed, because, and once the trap is being opened, but once it's sprung, your time is not going to be your own. It's going to be gig economy and all remote work and blah, blah, blah. But that's it for the future. Right now, students do seem to experience it as, I can be more flexible with my time because I can just take, my English professor's class and I can watch it some other way, at my leisure. So that's my suspicion about why that might be coming. Again, it's a misunderstanding, I think, from students about what's really, in my opinion, what's really coming.
Well, I think it's understandable. I mean, I have a ton of empathy for my students in terms of the conditions that they were being subjected to before COVID. I mean, it's, yeah, like who wants to commute? Who wants to, especially for the larger lecture courses, like who wants to go all the way to campus and sit in a room of sometimes like 1,200 people when you could just watch that lecture at home, right? But yeah, I mean, I think it's misinformed, or I think there's just an understanding of the implications of these sorts of what's framed as like accessibility options, right? Or it's framed as, it's framed always through the language of equity. And I'm not going to say like, no, there should never be any technology in a classroom ever under any circumstances. Of course not. Like it's not black and white. But I think it just seems to me that my colleagues, especially, which is, I mean, that's what really frustrates me, is that we're supposed to be advocates for our students. And yeah, I want them to have time. I absolutely want them to have time. And if it were up to me, I would throw out a lot of the conditions. I mean, I'd throw out the whole grading system, for example, right? And I think that's something that's come up during COVID, is like my department's been very like encouraging of like, yeah, just, go easy on everybody and be flexible and give extensions. And, that's like an example of like, yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, that's, it's super inequitable, and it's a terrible, terrible way to sort of frame education, in my opinion. But this larger understanding of like, well, what are the implications of these digital platforms? Where is your data going? I mean, that's something that is just completely overlooked. I mean, nobody's having conversations about what it means for students to submit in my classes, what, really, really personal content, potentially. These are writing classes. To submit that to a corporate platform, what does that mean? What are the implications? What are the risks? What are the moral questions around that? Even if you just want to talk about it hypothetically, like, those conversations aren't happening.
At some point, as you're experiencing all of this, I know for us, we've each shared, there's something going on or happening, or we start making connections to bigger things out in the world. So you're teaching, and you're told to transition to going online. At some point, when did you start feeling or realizing or making connections or feeling like there's something off about this? This is not, I think, the direction that we should be going, to the transition to confinement and online learning and all of those changes in public education, and including in other industries, because this has affected a lot of industries, the service industry, it's affected the medical industry. So I'm just curious if you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean, long term, I think, like, as I mentioned, I'm pretty old school. Like, I'm kind of a dinosaur in the way that I do my classes. Like, I want students with their, we do a lot of reading and a lot of writing in my classes. And so I like students to come in, if they're coming in for a workshop, they have their paper, they mark it up, they're exchanging it in their workshop group. If they're reading something, I'm huge on physically annotating it. And that's not because I think, technology is like evil or awful, just by the nature of it being technology. But I mean, as an English teacher, I've witnessed the difference between students who read and try to critique or analyze or pick apart information in that format versus on a screen. And I've also seen, like, over the past 8 years, again, anecdotal, but I've seen the attention span of my students decrease, like, just on average. They have a really hard time analyzing difficult information. And that's probably in part, a product of the K through 12 education system. It's a product of them being on social media way, way beyond the point of what I would consider to be healthy. It's a problem of them being anxious or depressed or not sleeping or not having time, like you said, Andy. But I mean, I also just think in general, like, for what I teach, like, I can't speak for other subjects and other fields, but the average person, it is very difficult to dissect and digest complex information through a screen or certainly through like an iPad or a phone, which is what a lot of students are using. I mean, I have a hard time with it. Like, if I'm reading even just like a long news article that has complex information in it, I want to print it out. So there's that. I mean, that's just kind of my experience and my understanding of, learning patterns and different styles. The past year, I mean, is that kind of what you meant, Eduardo, with the question, like, what made me question, like, more immediately in the past year?
Yeah, what made you get connected to us, connected to other communities, searching online, finding out what is happening here? There's something it's not sitting well. I think this is beyond COVID. We believe COVID exists, like, it's obvious that it exists, but this is something beyond COVID. This isn't sitting well with me, how this transition in public education, how there are massive changes that possibly going to happen because of the future that we're going into with tech and ed.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I was pretty questioning right from the beginning. exactly what enabled me to see, at least to some extent, what's happening, where many of my colleagues and friends and family, couldn't and don't seem to be able to. I don't know. That's a question that I've asked myself a lot, because I think I'm a relatively intelligent person who can critically think, but I also don't think that I'm particularly special. I will say, I think sort of outside of my teaching, to some extent related to my research, certainly in environmental humanities, coming from the world of environmental and animal rights activism, and then also paired with a sort of personal interest in holistic health and, just kind of increasingly leaning toward exiting from the allopathic sort of medical industrial complex world. Those two things, I think, probably contributed heavily to, from the beginning, questioning, is this really a public health crisis in the way that they are framing it? And I don't know. I mean, also just nobody seemed to have any discussions. Like, nobody asked the teachers or the students, for that matter, what do you think? What are the benefits? What are the costs? And I was kind of towing the line, kind of like, okay, all right, let's do this spring quarter. Let's teach this online. Maybe I'll learn a thing or two. But when it started to drag on into the summer and then into the fall, I mean, at a certain point, you kind of have to stop and weigh what's happening. And especially, having taught, a number of classes by that point. And I mean, just like an example, this is the younger kids, so not necessarily my student population, but earlier this year in 2021, the psychiatry and I think it's the psychiatry and behavioral unit at the Children's Hospital in my city, they ran out of beds in their overflow unit because they were having so many children admitted for attempted suicide. And I mean, this is just one example, but it's like, at what point are we going to stop and at least have an open debate, right? Like, I mean, that's crazy. Like, we've gotten to the point where we've pretty much made life unlivable, right, for the most vulnerable people, which is children. And to me, that's just like, regardless of how many cases, however people see, the public health crisis, like, that's a level of collateral damage that I'm just not willing to accept.
So then, following that inner doubt about the public health crisis, you had an experience where you said you shared with us, because we spoke with you before this, right? Maybe you can share with us that you had gone to some protest. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, like last year.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I was getting really fed up, and I think similar to you guys, just geographically, I live in probably one of the most COVID crazy parts of the country and world. I mean, there's just, it's pretty much just across the board compliance. And I was getting really fed up. I was like, am I the only person in this entire city who has a couple of questions? And I was able to connect through one of the few friends I have that was kind of on the same page as me. And I showed up at a protest and was able to connect with some other people in my area. And that was, I think, maybe August or September of 2020. And I've continued to, kind of build relationships with some of those people. And I mean, for the past, since the fall, so going on like, I don't know, 8-10 months, I've been pretty active in that circle, doing street actions, small scale protests, organizing in-person events, conversations, things like that. yeah, I mean, I don't know, the resistance, I guess, participating in the resistance to the extent that it exists where I am. And it's been really amazing, actually. It's obviously frustrating. We get a lot of resistance and critique, but we also get a surprising amount of support. And I think I had kind of shared with Andy and Eduardo when I spoke to you before. You know, one of the things that is really, really apparent to me is just the class divide, like being out at any given protest and seeing like who supports, you know, who honks their horn driving by if you're standing there with a sign, and who comes up and, you know, gives you the middle finger. It's pretty much like across the board, class lines, right? Like the people who are honking their horns, coming up, saying, thank you so much for being here. Like, oh my God, I thought I was the only one. It's working class. It's the truck drivers. It's people driving, you know, plumbing vans, delivery truck drivers, or just people like driving kind of, you know, beat up cars, having a hard time. Maybe they've lost their job. Maybe, you know, they're having health issues or family members having health issues. And then the people who get really upset and really like vocally critical are typically, you know, they're kind of working class professionals who most likely, you know, have been okay during this whole thing, and they're collecting their salary. And, you know, it's not to say they don't have problems, but it's not impacting them in the same way. And I think that's it's a little microcosm, but that's a big part of how I see this whole thing playing out. It really is it's an assault on the working class.
Could you say, because we had JP, who was a teacher from Southern California, and he's like, he knew he was being lied to, but when we asked it, like, but the question was, I know this a lot, I was being lied to, but to say what I really think is going on, that he felt was harder. So you knew you were being lied to. What do you think is going on? How would you describe what you're resisting, who you're resisting, and what's really in play here?
I see a global techno-fascist biosecurity state being built at breakneck speed, is kind of what I would sum it up to be. And in my school, like in the context of education specifically, what I see is teachers and educators like laying the bricks to build that digital prison, and students too. I mean, students too. Like we're all just kind of literally building our own cages, and that's what's been so frustrating is like teachers like literally begging to stay remote or to have more technology, you know, just as I see it, like digging the grave for our own profession, recording their lectures, throwing them up on Google, throwing them up on Instructure or Panopto. That's literally the name of the lecture capture that we use at my institution. It's called Panopto, as in Panopticon. Like, what world are we in? And I think, I mean, that's what it is, right? It's like, it's the true sort of definition of control of a population, right? Is to not only subjugate them, you know, or a class of people, but to actually convince them that they like it, right? To get them to experience that subjugation as empowerment or equity or comfort. Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question, Andy?
But that's a
went off on teachers.
Jeez. I don't think I could do it that succinctly. That was damn good. But okay, I do have a question. Then what were your resources for pulling this together? What were the key places you went to find that out, or to put that picture together? Because that's very specific.
I mean, I can tell you, like, the people that I read a lot or listen to are people like Allison McDowell, who I know you have had on regularly, people like Whitney Webb. I mean, I can tell you sort of like who I read. James Corbett, I think, has done phenomenal, like really, you know, very research-based, well-documented work. I will say one of the people that I think was pivotal for me, who I'm sure you guys know her work, Cory Morningstar. So I read her coming from the world of like environmental activism and environmental humanities. I was pretty entrenched in the sort of nonprofit, corporate captured environmental movement for some time. And 2019, I read her series, what's it called? Manufacturing of Greta Thunberg. It's like a book length series, which I recommend everybody read. And you can get it as a book, actually. And I recommend reading it in the book form as opposed to online if you can. And I read that and it kind of rocked my world just within the sort of environmentalism, like ecology world. And I think, you know, looking back, I'm not sure how quickly or how I would have been able to kind of put this together if not for that sort of experience. And just, you know, I felt in retrospect, I sort of dipped my toes into that kind of critique, even just within that sort of one sphere that now, yeah, I mean, spring 2020 came along and I think, you know, it wasn't necessarily that I was like, oh, I read that and now I can see what's happening, but you know, slowly you start to put the pieces together and you read other people and you listen to different dissenting voices. And then it's also been, I mean, once I was able to connect with other people in my area, I mean, that's been really valuable to me because like you guys, I was a leftist, I am a leftist. But you know, in retrospect, I'm realizing how sort of narrow the lane that I was in before really was. And so a lot of the people that I've connected with over the past year are not who I would expect to be hanging out with and certainly not doing activism with, right? I mean, it's everyone from, yeah, there's some leftists, but it's, you know, there's conservatives, there's libertarians, there's people who voted for Trump, there's people who voted for Bernie, there's people who didn't vote at all. And I mean, there's material differences between, you know, my beliefs and values and political, you know, persuasions and some of those people that are, you know, they're important differences, but like, man, we gotta work together here. So it's been really humbling and it's been a learning experience for me to just kind of have conversations across difference, right? Which is like what, getting back to academia, like that's what I wanted to do in the first place is have debates and, you know, myself question things and also have my opinions questioned, right? It's been very humbling to be like, oh, wow, okay. Yeah, maybe I was wrong about a few things.
It's interesting because I myself, we live in San Francisco, or now Andy lives in Oakland, but he lived here for many, many years. And there is a climate that I am sure is very similar to Seattle, right? And most of our doubts and questioning of any sort of lockdown, confinement, or anything around tech in ed and anything that is counter to the mainstream of these very liberal, progressive cities, it just, even in academia, I can just imagine, is just challenging to think alternatively. It's challenging to voice anything. I think more than half of my friends are on the liberal left on Facebook, and anything I post, they have seen but skip now, and now they're in the skipping zone. But before they used to just comment and comment. So they tell me, because I seen it, I thought, well, now nothing is getting through. I don't think anybody's reading, but they tell, no, we deliberately skip you. And so, so I'm just wondering, how do you deal with that?
Oh, I wish I had a solution. I mean, yeah,
What is it like? What's your experience being, you know, just against the grain, or against the mainstream, and we're here on what's left. This is a leftist circle here. This is a certain community, but we question the very left, and a lot of people think we're uplifting more right-wing voices, or we're being conservative. I don't know what we know. People think we've fallen off a track, but so your experience?
Everyone in my life thinks I've fallen off track. Yeah. It's really hard. I think it's really easy to identify the propaganda that you disagree with, right? It's much harder to identify propaganda or information that challenges your beliefs. And I mean, it's come to a head during COVID because people are feeling it in such an embodied way. Like, I've had arguments with family members and friends in terms of, like who you vote for or how you see this political issue or not. But now it's like, don't get near me, right? Like, you're a walking biohazard. So I think that, it's just like take everything up to 11, right? It's no longer like this sort of comfortable political discussion that you can have, or maybe it's not comfortable, but you can walk away from it, right? After the coffee date or the family Thanksgiving or whatnot. But I think, just in terms of the left, and I know this is, like what's left, right? Like, this is kind of, a major question and frustration that you guys have been struggling with since pre-COVID. I grew up post 9/11 era. The first protest I ever went to was protesting the Iraq War. And, I've been, as I said, like pretty active in my, since my adult life in environmental activism, animal rights activism. But I've grown really increasingly frustrated with, I guess, the mainstream left. I remember I turned 18 right as Obama was running for his first term. Like, that was my first vote. And I remember feeling really hopeful, right? And then the slow realization sort of over years, a decade, kind of like, the realization and horror of what actually happened, like what we do to other countries, like what, and a lot of times it's coming from the left, or it's bipartisan, right? Like, and what we do also to our own people, right? Like immigrants and the working poor. And then I think with Trump, certainly in academia, people just lost their mind. Like, really, that's how I feel like, he's awful. He's awful. But now it's in the, I guess, post-Trump era, right? Like, the left has just completely lost the plot. Like, I thought we were about waging class struggle. I thought we were about fighting big pharma. I thought we were about opposing militarism, protecting the earth. But it seems like hardly anyone is fighting for that anymore. So I didn't answer your question. I don't know what to do with the sort of frustrations people feel. It's not comfortable to have your own sort of side critiqued, right? So of course, when as leftists we critique the left, of course it's going to be received by some people as like, oh, well, you're holding up whatever, like right-wing views. And it's very bizarre. It's very bizarre to be like, I've been called a Trumpist for protesting lockdowns. But then, there's right-wingers who go to these protests who call me a Marxist, like, as an insult. It's very weird, right? The language has sort of been, I don't know, sort of emptied of meaning.
I'm actually curious about that, what you just said about the language, the rhetoric, since that's kind of your training. Is there anything that, that is particularly, a highlight of how this narrative has been constructed, in the public sphere, in the media and these narratives?
I think people could just start with reading Orwell, honestly. Just so much of the language I mean, and what I consider to be propaganda, you know, the stay safe, safer at home, all of these kind of turns of phrase, right, which are they're being wielded and unfurled at such scale that it's really, I mean, that's a huge red flag for me, right? Like when you see this coming, like it's across institutions, across states, globally, that to me is concerning. And then you kind of place it in this larger framework of like some of the like critiques, broad scale critiques of the left that I've just kind of brought up. And you think about, you know, Department of Defense. It's not a Department of Defense. It's a Department of War, right? Safer at home. Are we safer at home? Like, I know, Andy, you've talked about like this idea of, well, maybe not. Maybe that's not actually what safety is in the context of schooling.
My social worker friend, she works in the school district, and and even some of our guests that we've had here have said that they don't like this phrase "safer at home" because there's so much that happens at home that isn't safe. I mean, for other reasons, right? That they're talking more the social, emotional, and maybe abuse and this other stuff, that it's so dismissive of people's experiences, because not everyone, especially if we think about the global South, not everyone could just be at home. I mean, some people will die from starvation if they're not going out and working, right? I mean, it's a system that we live in as well. So there are many areas that we can look at this. So, anyhow.
Yeah, I mean, I think like especially this just complete failure to expand our worldview beyond the US, beyond the West. I mean, that's a huge problem with our education system, with the political conversations that we have. And I mean, yeah, it's exactly right what you just said. Like these lockdowns, I mean, in other countries, like it's not, you know, you lose your job, you know, whatever, you're uncomfortable because you can't go outside, like you die. Sometimes you die in these countries from lockdown. And I think, I don't know, no one seems to be willing to sort of wrestle with that reality.
And I wanted to add that, you know, because that's kind of what I did during the pandemic, is that stuff also happens here, you know, in the poorer communities. People were criticized for still going out to work and, you know, in engaging in activities, you know, as if it was normal. But again, they couldn't afford to stay home for many reasons, like you mentioned before. So that doesn't just happen in other countries. It happens in a lot of the poor communities in this nation. And like you said, you know, that's why a lot of people, the working people, they were more frustrated. And like in my anecdotal experience here, the more educated people were, the more, you know, the ones more willing to shame others and you know, and ostracize for not adhering to the, you know, whatever the CDC said. And so again, my point is that also happens here, you know, and it's just not visible to everyone.
I had a student, the very first class I taught, so spring of 2020, and we're dealing with this whole question of like, do you make kids turn on their Zoom camera or not, right? Which I refuse to require it. I mean, I think most people, I haven't heard anyone like absolutely require it. But I had a student who, she didn't have a desk in her home space, right? Like she did not have a workspace. I mean, and this may not even have been a case of like, you know, extreme, she wasn't in extreme poverty or like some of the situations you're describing, Kenny, right? But even like something like that, like she was tuning into class from her bed, and she felt the need to let me know why she wasn't turning on her camera, because she didn't want to have her camera in her bed because it felt weird, understandably so, right? So like even just, you know, stuff that people don't seem to think about, right? It's like, yeah, I mean, not everybody has the resources and the circumstances that are going to enable them to survive this kind of lifestyle long term or even short term, let alone to, you know, try to actually thrive during this time.
Yeah, and I'd like to, Kenny was probably the first one to say this thing about make a connection of like the more formally educated you are, the more you buy into this narrative, and the more you are like you said, not just helping build a prison, but you're fighting anyone who's trying to get out of it. Like you're saying, everyone get into it, Right. So, and you got your PhD and I got my PhD. So we are all way up here with the formal education. How do you make sense of that? Or first of all, I imagine you agree with that, but how do you make sense of, particularly in these halls that are supposed to be so, critical thinking, these left alcoves, these Marxist centers that the colleges are talked about, that the right is like terrified of it in some ways. So how do you make sense of that? Seems to be a reality.
I mean, I think it's in some sense a form of elitism, right? I mean, we are, as like academics, I mean, I don't make a very good living. I'm struggling. I actually don't have a desk because we have a desk. I'm continuing to work at my kitchen table, but I do think, I mean, we're more comfortable, right? I mean, like if you go like Marxist critique, like we're the petite bourgeoisie. And so I think the idea of resistance, whatever that might look like, it's a little scary for a lot of us, right? It's going to be uncomfortable. And I mean, I don't know, it depends on the day, sort of how pessimistic I am about the future. But when I think about, okay, well, what would it look like for us, for the resistance to sort of take shape and like win, right? And build the sort of world that we want to build. And I think in order for that to happen, I mean, the system has to come down, like in a really radical way, right? Like the empire has to fall type of a scenario, like burn it to the ground, and that sounds radical. I mean, what's the Virginia Woolf, right? Like, what did she write, about burn the college to the ground, right? And then the daughters and the mothers like dance around the fire. And I think for a lot of us, like to throw a log onto that fire, so to speak, is scary because we potentially might lose a lot of the things that have made us feel comfortable and made us feel successful and made us feel, sometimes like we're better than the working class or better than the Trump voters or whoever it may be. And so I think there's a certain degree of like moral courage that I think has to be summoned. And I'm not sure how to sort of foster that among even just like my little small circles.
This makes me think of, so Michelle Alexander talks about the racial bribe. And this to me is like the professional bribe, that, so people are bribed with the status and, this separation of we are different than, a certain class of the society, even though, like you said, some people are still struggling. This still happens in the restaurant industry where I am at, where people would rather take a title of manager, even though they're going to earn less money, and struggle. But the status part, right, is the bribe that happens. At least that's one of my thoughts. I'm curious about, your thoughts about the vaccine, Jessica, and that is connected, right, as to what's happening like in your university, what's being required. Because I know some kids, like the kid that we know, I don't want to say the name, that's going to Stanford, they are required to have a vaccine because they are going to have an open campus. So I'm kind of curious as to what is being required, from your institution for students in terms of the vaccine. And also maybe if you can share what your thoughts are about the vaccine itself.
So, I mean, I I have no idea what's going to happen in the fall, but at least the one thing I do know is that my university has announced that they are requiring vaccines. They have mandated it for both students and for staff, all staff, basically anybody who's going to be on campus. And supposedly exemptions are going to be offered. They have yet to disclose exactly what the protocol and process of obtaining one will be like and what will be required for those that are granted an exemption in terms of masking, distancing, reasonable accommodation, right, as the sort of legal term that I think we're kind of dancing around there. So yeah, it's pretty scary in terms of my own thoughts on the vaccines. I think, in my opinion, any sort of medical intervention, whether that's a PCR test, a vaccine, a mask, a cup of mineral water, a B12 supplement, I think it has to be up to the individual. Ultimately, I think it has to be administered with informed consent, and it can't be coerced or forced. And I do see these mandates as coercion. We're seeing so many different forms of incentivizing, right? And I find it really disturbing. I think it's so important with all of the public health discussions and debates to keep coming back to the numbers, right? And we have to keep reminding people that the overall infection survival rate, even by the most allopathic mainstream numbers, the overall infection survival rate is like 99.77, I think, percent across the board. And then for under 70-year-olds, it's 99.95. And those numbers are from the meta-analysis, right? From earlier to 2021, it was like, I think it was about like 70 something different estimates from dozens and dozens of studies, like 50 something places all over the world. So for children K through 12, and then even for my students who are mostly like 18 to 22, and then teachers who are largely under 70, there is a greater chance of dying in a car wreck on the way to school than from COVID at school. And I'm not saying that 0.05% of the population doesn't matter. Of course they matter, but I think the other piece that it's not getting talked about is there are treatments, right? There's both naturopathic and pharmaceutical treatments that have shown to be very, very low risk and very, very effective. You have ivermectin, you have hydroxy paired with zinc, you have high dosage vitamin D, high dosage vitamin C, have nebulized hydrogen peroxide. There are options, and if those, I suppose, right, like if those options were being more transparently talked about and offered, they'd have to pull the EUA, right? And I think for my students, the school has been really, really slick with their language in their announcements for the mandates. They keep referring to it as an FDA authorized vaccine, which is technically true, right? But it makes it sound as if it's had approval. So, I find it really criminal that a lot of those treatments, particularly ivermectin, because it just seems to be so incredibly effective, have been, people are either not being informed that they have options if they do happen to get sick, if they are in that very, very, very small percentage of people who do get really sick, So they're either not being informed, or in some cases they're being denied access. I know there was that woman in, I think it was somewhere in the Midwest, that even under a court order, they wouldn't give her family member ivermectin upon request. And instead it's like, we just continued to isolate, continued to vent people, and then focused all of our money, all of our resources, all of our efforts on vaccinating, and then demonizing anybody who even just says like, I want to hold off for right now, for whatever reason, even if they're immunocompromised, even if they're, whatever the reason is, right? I mean, that's a decision that should be up to the individual. And then, this is kind of getting into, I don't know if you guys wanted to get into like the passport stuff, but it does not make sense to mandate a vaccine, based on trials that only tested for reduction of symptoms, right? They didn't test for transmission. So what is the point of a mandate? And then, also what is the point of a vaccine passport based on science that's largely irrelevant in terms of this sort of what I consider to be a myth of the asymptomatic carrier, right? Like we're all just walking human biohazards.
And how do you answer that question then? Like, well, what's the point? So what do you see as the point between the push to essentially vaccinate an age group, which is 0.00, I don't know if I get the 0.0004% chance of dying, I think, for 0 to 20. And that, like you said, those are CDC numbers. This isn't, this is like using their stuff. What do you understand as the point for getting essentially everyone vaccinated?
Yeah, I mean, it's shots in arms, right? Like that's the way they're talking about it, is like, we just got to get shots in arms. To me, I mean, I just think it's completely ridiculous to think that these institutions and corporations and governments care about people's health. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, in terms of what they're trying to accomplish with this push toward quote unquote herd immunity, I don't know. I mean, I don't know for sure. I do think that particularly the mRNA vaccines, I am scared of the product itself. Based on what what research I have done, I absolutely think it is a dangerous product in and of itself. But I also think it's one very specific tool in terms of this larger, like we're talking about the larger sort of structure of a biosecurity state. I mean, it's a platform, right? And I think if people think like, oh, I'll just get this one vaccine, maybe I'll risk it. I think they're kidding themselves. I mean, I think this is a platform that's going to be extending far, far into the future in terms of things like digital passports. I mean, they're already talking about booster shots. These databases that are being created, whether it's by governments or like employers, right? Employers being encouraged to keep a database of people's vaccination records. Mm-hmm. Same thing with the schools, right? They're going to have a list. So I think it's scary in and of itself, but I think the sort of long-term implications of these, industrialized digital platforms, gene therapy that's what really scares me in the long term, beyond sort of the immediate question of like, will they give me an exemption, which is also a legitimate question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like when Allison and other people who talk about blockchain being put into here, that paper that your students submitted is on that same blockchain dashboard for them as their PCR test that they took, as the wages that they make, what job that they did, as when they logged on and when they logged off of anything, of everything, essentially anything they've done, as well as their vaccine. So that is where all these things will I do believe are going to come together. It's going to, every piece of information about us is going to be known. Not just by myself, but by the government, by corporations.
I was thinking maybe this is a point where we talk about like solutions or, you know, responses to what you see happening. How do we fight back? What are some of your thoughts, you know, maybe within your own network, your workplace, your community? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, unfortunately, I don't even think the question is how, not yet anyway, and at least in my region, I guess. I mean, right now, based on what I'm seeing among my colleagues, they won't fight or push back at all, like, let alone like how, like in the way that I want. But it seems to me, especially in terms of education, I do think we kind of have like a very small window here, where teachers are not entirely disposable or replaceable right now. You know, the LMSs and the digitized learning platforms and the AI, like it's not there yet, which means we have power if we want to take it. I think that most of the sort of like proposed solutions to like problems in the world, you know, whether it's like capitalism, you know, climate change, poverty, like the solutions that were being sold are market-based solutions coming from the very centers of power that created the mess, right? And it's, I mean, this is like so often kind of what it comes back to for me is like, you know, how is big pharma going to get us out of a health crisis? How are capitalists and imperialists, like, why would we trust them to solve the problems that are caused by capitalism and imperialism? So I think in terms of solutions, like, I don't know. I just know we need to reject those manufactured false solutions outright. And I think we need to start defining the parameters of the discussion ourselves, like you guys are doing here on this podcast, right? Like, we get to define that stuff. And then in terms of like, how do we resist? I think I don't have like a good solution. I mean, my little tiny group here in Seattle, like we worked our ass off just to get like 300 people out at a protest. It's an uphill battle in some regions, but I think resist in any way you can, you know, I mean, and certainly talking to each other, I think is like a good kind of place to start, like just getting out into the world and preferably in person.
Yeah.
Like talk to people who are like-minded, talk to people who you think might listen, but also like talk to people who maybe you think you disagree with and maybe you do disagree with. That, I mean, like I kind of said before, like that's one thing I've learned the past year is that I have a lot more in common with other people in my community, like whatever their political persuasion, we have a lot more in common with each other than we do with, you know, our overlords, right? The ruling class, and a lot more power than they would have us believe, at least at this point. So I think a lot of it, yeah, I mean, we want the same things, right? Like a lot of us want the same things. We want health, we want happiness and freedom for ourselves and our families and our communities. And so we're going to have to work together. I think as a teacher, like my top priority is this kind of the same as it's always been, which is to foster critical thinking in my students, is to teach them how to think, not what to think. There's a really great line in Nabokov where he says, curiosity is insubordination in its purest form. So I think that's like such a great crystal. Like we all need to be more curious and thereby more insubordinate in whatever ways that we can.
Mm-hmm. Next, in about a month from now, I want to put together for what's left a teacher panel about reopening schools. Like, what are we going to do? We may know a little bit more about what's coming at that point, but I definitely thought about you as being a person on that. It's mostly going to be more K through 12, but I think to have you there as well would be good. But I wanted to get your thoughts because I know you said, hey, I'm not against tech. You know, you said that. And I've been talking to some teachers. I feel like we have to start saying we are against tech. I do feel like part of me now we have to go towards what the old Luddites of old, who basically said, we're tearing this thing apart, we're taking it out, we're uprooting it. Now, and that's what I would, if teachers were on board, that's what I would say we would need to do, is like we would literally begin to break up that physical infrastructure, because this world, the prison is being built through tech. So it's part of the prison, not the whole, but part of it is being built through that. So I would say that. I guess what do you make of that? Like, that's maybe a question I have, kind of loading the dice for myself, because I am increasingly coming of the mind that we who have been played footsie with tech, but I also have been kind of reluctant. Like, I don't think you learn that well with it, but now I feel like I have to make a break and an open break in my schools and in my classes, and speak of it as something, as opposition to the world that's being constructed.
I think that's fair. I said I'm not against tech, just sort of like inherently by the nature of it being tech, but I agree with you. And I think there is it kind of comes back to that idea of like defining the parameters of the discussion, like this idea that systems or platforms are like inherently neutral, right? Which is not true. Like, it's just not true. Particularly when they're owned by corporate institutions. Like at my institution, right? Like all of the servers, they're Amazon servers, right? Like they're housed by one of the largest, most evil corporations, which the left is so quick to critique in other contexts, right? And I just think, if we can't call that out for what it is, I don't know what we're doing as teachers. We're allowing them to commodify our students even more. They've already been doing it, but I gave a talk to like 6 people at my institution, and it was just called like, students are not data commodity. My students are not data commodities, and hat tip there to Allison and her work. But yeah, I'm with you. Like, it's not welcome in my classroom. It never has been, but now it's just more important than ever.
I think we're all going to become Luddites.
I know. I want to read about those folks. I feel like
we should, because I think they didn't necessarily oppose the factory movement or the machinery. It was more so that they saw that they didn't have any say, or they didn't have any voice in it, and so they decided, then, you know what, forget it. Let's just break into this and let's just destroy it, because it's not about just taking our jobs. It's that we have no say, we have no agency over this. No? So I think
right, and like such a not to keep on Amazon specifically, but they deserve it. You have like in my state, Amazon donating laptops and tablets for remote learning, which I think is going on all over the country. And it's
Google.
Oh, really? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Probably Google here too. It's just like what are people thinking? Like, do they really believe that these corporations are philanthropic in any way, shape, or form? Like, these are union busters. These are profit greedy centers of power. Like Amazon thinks it's acceptable, right, for workers to piss into bottles, because apparently like bathroom breaks would be too damaging to their bottom line, right? But now all of a sudden they care about public health and they care about the well-being of our children. Like, it's patently ridiculous. And same thing, my institution, they torture live animals without any anesthetic for research purposes. They continue to use prison labor. They do not care about the vulnerable. They do not care about Black people, public health, equity. They care about money. And now, like coming back to the vaccines, now they want to make a public education conditional upon you taking an experimental pharmaceutical product for a virus with almost 100% recovery rate. That is that is sickness in the mind
Yeah.
to me. Like that's real.
You're going to get this episode shut down.
Oh no. You can cut anything you want.
We're not cutting that. We're keeping all the stuff that's going to give us a community strike. I love it.
Okay. It's like, shut down. We already had 3 strikes.
Eduardo, we asked the question about the last one about Jessica's book.
Yeah. Where do you think you fall, like, on this political spectrum? Or how would you, or ideology, how do you think that you would identify yourself? I mean, yeah.
Sure. I would say I'm a fervent anti-capitalist, if that's not clear. I think now more than ever, like industrial capitalism, it's destroying the earth. It won't stop. It's not going to stop right until every inch of the planet has been commodified and financialized and exploited, and probably space too, right? And I think looking around, like, I know this is kind of a socialist podcast to some extent. I think the class analysis is missing. I mean, it is completely absent right now. I'm not a Marxist, but I think that analysis and that critique of capitalism that Marx provides it's second to none. And I think maybe paired with a little bit of like Silvia Federici. As a woman, I can't leave that aspect of it out. But I think
who's that? Because I don't know that person so well.
Oh yeah, I mean she writes mostly about labor from the frame of sort of like the history of women's reproduction. And I think, so few people are reading Marx, or certainly Federici, but so few people are reading anything. Which gets us back to education and like why I became an English teacher in the first place. So to answer your question, I think I'm leaning more toward kind of an anarchist persuasion these days. I guess you could say green anarchism, because for me, the earth, the animals, ecosystems, ecology, like that's everything. Like that's what it is to be at home in the world as human animals. And I'm also a radical feminist, which is another analysis that I think has kind of been smeared and stamped out of education almost completely. Like it's almost a dirty word in academia right now. And to me, it's pretty plain to see that what's happening right now is not only a result of years of industrial capitalism, but it's also patriarchy, right? Like assaults on and attempts to control reproduction, birth, labor, women's bodies, women's power, really. And I think we have to take that back. Like we got to take it back fast.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing all this stuff, Jessica. You said some of this stuff was like, I really could relate. I don't know if it's because you're watching too many episodes of What's Left, but I was totally like, yeah, that's how I would say it. So
That's a compliment.
So I really appreciate you taking the time to share your stuff with us.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the conversation and all of the work that all 3 of you are doing.
I also want to say that I think the group, are you continuing to work with that group that you did the demonstrations with? You all still kind of get together?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what everyone needs to be doing, is kind of finding, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be doing a protest together, but right now it's finding the group that's willing to meet in person, that's willing to like talk about this stuff. I do think that's what everyone who is trying to figure out what to do needs to be kind of becoming a little bit of a node of association, of human association.
Earlier you said something about, being in a lane. And, I think that what you're doing, it's what we need to be doing, actually. Get out of your lane, explore and explore terrain of ideas, debates, and, expose your ideas, really. Otherwise, find yourself in some gang mentality. And that's where we're at right now.
Do you think there's anything else we have to Wait,
You want to add, Jessica?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm sure we could go for hours more, but I think it seems like a natural stopping point.
All right, here we are. That does it for this week's episode. Dr. Jessica teaches English literature, writing, and environmental humanities at the university level in Washington State. She has been teaching college students for 8 years and holds a PhD in English. She is also an active member of environmental and animal rights activist communities. And we'll link information or anything you want to share with us on the episode notes, Jessica. What's Left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes where we found this episode or on our blog at what-s-left.webnote.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast / channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you have heard here, please share your favorite episodes, rate, review, subscribe, turn on your notifications to any of our platforms on podcasts, Spotify, iTunes Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, or Bitchute, LBRY, LBRY, Odysee, ODYSEE, or YouTube, and Telegram. And if you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-hosts Kenny Cepeda and Andy Lipsum. Thank you very much for being here, Dr. Jessica.
All right.
See you all next time.